Hey, get in, fellas. We're going to therapy. Welcome to session 17. And boy, am I stoked. We're going to piece both the topic and the interview together today. We're going to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about with patients when they're frustrated with other people in their lives is to say, we all get older. It does not mean we grow up, and understanding what that means in our lives and how to understand that thought best. We're going to blend that right into my favorite topic in mental health, in psychiatry, in psychology. It does not matter how you frame this. We're going to learn today about personality and the idea that defense mechanisms that we've been learning about on the Instagram are ways that we express our personality based on our development and our unique set of circumstances. So Dr. Tareq Yaqub is a professor at Northwestern, so fancy, who also really, really loves personality, psychodynamic thinking, and defenses. So we have a really good time. So good, in fact, that it is a two-part interview. So stay tuned. We're going to introduce the idea of personality and defense mechanisms. We're going to get about halfway through the different personality types. And then next week, we're going to clean it up with some of the really big name, personality types like borderline personality, narcissism, antisocial. That'll all come at you next week. So certainly worth picking back up next week. We're going to end the show with a Bro Motions Hall of Fame new inductee, Abraham Lincoln. And when you listen to the interview with Tareq, you'll see why that was so necessary this week after your boy put his foot in his mouth. So let's go, y'all. Y'all ever heard the old adage, age is just a number? It's like kind of confusing, right? I'm going to do you one better. I like to tell people that we all get older. It doesn't mean we grow up. And it seems to resonate with people. This idea that, certain people show certain maturity level. We all know very mature younger people, kids who are parentified by needs of their parents, teenagers who just have a nice sense of maturity. And we also know adults who just really don't seem all that grown up, 20-year-olds, 25, 30-year-olds who are having a tough time emancipating from their parents' homes. And then furthermore, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who still seem to struggle with those immature defense mechanisms that we've been talking about. So splitting, projection, denial, all those things we've talked about as immature defenses. And I thought it prudent with Tareq's lecture today on defense mechanisms and personality to think about these defense mechanisms in terms of development. We'll cover development a lot more in a few weeks with Dr. Christie. And I think this is an idea that we need to sit with before we can understand the full spectrum of who humans are. So the idea here is that we have stages of development. Okay, I'm going to give an overview today with more to come in the next few episodes. At each one of those stages, we're meant to accomplish a task. We're meant to learn something. We're meant to master something. And so I've talked a lot already about our first goal is trust versus mistrust, the first Ericksonian stage. And Erickson's a guy we're going to learn more about who identified different kind of goals of each stage of life. So when you first pop out the womb, your job is to establish trust versus mistrust. So can you trust your caregivers to wipe your bottom, keep you safe, attend to your cries, keep you fed, keep you happy and safe? So we've all known people who really struggle with trust, who really struggle to worry again about people abandoning them. We know about borderline personality. We're going to learn a lot more later. So the idea here is that if somebody's had something happen, if somebody's had bad trauma early on in their life, like we've learned in The Body Keeps the Score, because we are a product of things that happen around us combined with some genetics, that you can't get out of those stages. You can't get out of even that first basic stage. So in some ways, you are operating like an infant when you regress all the way back to splitting, denial. Now, this doesn't mean you're always in that state of mind. We're going to learn that stressors can push you in one direction or another, but this explains that if you did not have a safe base in your upbringing, if you were not able to feel safe in this world, that you're going to be more easily pushed towards those immature defenses, or what we would say regressing. So we all know adults who have temper tantrums. That's called acting out. It's an immature defense mechanism. And again, we all know kids who have been able to work past that stuff. And because of the safety and security that they've established early on, they present very maturely and they're able to open their eyes up and understand what's going on around them. So in order to be a mature adult, you need to be able to get out of your own head and understand the perspectives of the world around you. That's called mentalizing. We've all heard the expression, put yourself in someone else's shoes. I think that it's the idea of being able to put yourself in that person's mind while they're also wearing their own shoes. It's a little bit different than what you would do in that situation. That was golden rule stuff versus platinum rule, we talked about a couple weeks ago. The idea that you can put yourself in their mind while they're in their own shoes. You don't need to think about what you would do, but think about their perspective. And so that requires a decent amount of maturity. In fact, we're not inherently great at that until we mature past adolescence. And so the idea here is that what I'll hear a lot from people is, why is that person acting so immature? They're older than I am. Or, wow, I was so impressed by the grace of that kid or the grace of that teenager. And it's because they might not be as mature as their age says. We really make a lot of assumptions about the kind of things people can handle simply based on their numeric age. And that's how I wanted to introduce this topic today, is that age is truly just a number, or as I love to say, we all get older numerically. It does not mean we grow up maturity-wise. So what I want everybody to take away from this is the idea that, hey, we are all different. We've had different experiences, and those experiences have locked us into different levels of development. And, just carry that around. I want you to understand when somebody's acting in a way that doesn't make sense to you, or something that you're either impressed by how mature they are, which might not be great. If a kid has to be super mature, super fast, then that's not always a good thing. Or if they're acting very immature in front of you and it's confusing you, let's just remember that people have had a whole world of experiences, and that might have made it hard for them to really grow up. And it's frustrating, especially because we expect adults, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, to be adults. And the sad truth of the matter is the hard work it takes to push beyond developmental trauma and things that lock us into these more immature defenses is really hard work. And American healthcare does not have access to resources readily enough to take care of people who struggle that way. Some people get lucky to get into care. Some people have money, fortunately. Some people are just really resourceful. And so just to wrap up, our goal here is to be kinder and gentler. And in general, that is to understand the experience of others. To be nice is what we know. To be kind is to be able to empathize and mentalize. And so these next few topics that we're going to cover. So development, personality, defense mechanisms, self-states, attachment. That's what we've all got coming down the pipe. The rest of this block. Put yourself in the mindset of maybe not your own experience, but experiences of people that you've known and maybe been frustrated with over time. What is it about their life story that's made it hard for them to develop more mature defenses and just more mature ways of being in the world? So we're going to move on next to an awesome interview that's going to be 2 parts with Dr. Tareq Yaqub, professor at Northwestern. See you in a minute. So Tareq, you came dressed, it looks like. So I'm wearing my country western with a elbow patch and a LeBron high school jersey underneath. Rep, what do you got on?
St. Vincent, St. Mary's. I like it.
Oh,
I got the patch. I'm sorry you always have to rep that horrible state, but
what a perfect way to introduce this week's guest, Mr. Tareq Yaqub, a native of the suburbs of Detroit. He would not let me call him a Detroit native, so fuck Michigan. Tareq went to undergrad at the University of Michigan because he's a world-class piece of shit. And from there, he went to Michigan State Medical School, Medical College of Wisconsin for residency. If you recall, that is where our buddy Dr. Satish went, and that's how I know Tareq. We'll banter into that. And he did his fellowship back in Michigan because he's a scumbag. He is a football fan, and I hope he's ready to get what is coming to him because they've been lucky as fuck in all their games so far.
They look horrible. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, you don't get to interrupt the introduction. Hold on. No, Lions fan. He, like Satish, adopted the Milwaukee Bucks. Tareq is now, Dr. Yaqub is now a clinical professor, which is like your first step into the academic medicine world. An assistant professor at Northwestern, which is Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, where he does child psych inpatient work like Satish and Zach that we've talked to the last 2 weeks. And he also is really big on med student resident education. So Dr. Yaqub did some extra training. We'll have him talk about that in this type of psychodynamic thinking that neither Zach, Satish, or I have done. In his free time, Tareq likes to do tennis, which he claims is only mindful when he wins. So he's got a John McEnroe streak we learned. He likes to lift weights, as you can tell by his physique and broad shoulders. And then he's also a big fan of live music. Tareq, tell us about the last good concert you saw.
I just saw Kate Renata last week. He's a
Sure.
great DJ.
Yeah, I was going to say stuff. I don't know. I'm not that cool.
Yeah, yeah. But, it's funky. It's good. People are dancing. It's not one of those shows where people are just bopping their heads. It's
Speaking
very
of
nice.
dancing shows, the day this episode comes out this Wednesday, I'm going to Anderson Paak at Red Rocks.
Nice.
Fucking rule. So we're very excited. Tareq, what do you think about the fact that now that Michigan's not cheating anymore, they're getting, they're winning games because they have better players. They look like shit.
They look like shit. I think a lot of Michigan fans are delusional, and we're often overrated every year. Last year, our prayers were answered, but
you also had a bunch of 27-year-olds on the roster. Let's make sure we remember that. Jim Harbaugh, great guy, Michigan man, just overlooked cheating for the entire season. So he didn't know. He never knew Connor Stallion. Never knew him.
Who is this guy, Connor? I never even heard of him until these stories came out.
Yeah.
They just invented him. They invented him.
He's a fictional. Now, how you feel about the Lions?
I actually am not a big Jared Goff guy.
We're a Jared Goff podcast because he's a bro. He's a chill fucking bro.
He is. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not a fan of him as a person.
Okay.
I'm not a fan of him as a quarterback because when he does not have the best O-line in football, when that pocket collapses, is maybe the worst quarterback in the NFL.
Okay, we cannot agree on Michigan-Ohio State talk. Here's where we can't agree. Lions and Bengals fans have been homies. Kind of like Bengals and Bills fans because, we weren't really a threat, so you could support one another. So Jared Goff is Andy Dalton, and I loved Andy Dalton. I'm a huge Andy Dalton apologist. In fact, we played the Panthers today, and I was half rooting for Andy Dalton revenge game. I'm glad the Bengals won. It saved our season, right? But so same with Dalton, right? You're paying him less than you're paying Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes, and that allows you to spend more money on other things.
But they just gave him huge money.
Did they? What number? Yeah. What number money? Is he? What
Let
number
me see.
Quarterback play is he? Yeah. So
Jared Goff.
While you look this up, Tareq, I will cover the time with when Dalton broke his hand in 2015, right before the playoffs. That team was set to make a playoff run deep. 2015, the offense was amazing, and then that first round playoff game is when Vontaze Burfict and Joey Porter came onto the field, and Antonio Brown got CTE that game, says everybody. So, Andy Dalton, that's where the Alabama quarterback, who was our backup, I'm blanking on the name, played pretty well and almost led us to a playoff win. So, Tareq, what number ranking is Jared Goff paid?
He's the 5th highest paid quarterback in the NFL this year. He's earning over $50 million.
Because he's not on his rookie deal. So really he's but yes, that's the deal. You're not going to have to draft a quarterback.
Hey, let me tell you who he gets paid. Let me tell you who he gets paid more than, okay? Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson. Patrick Mahomes. Josh Allen.
Wait. Dude, I guess those guys just got deals a couple years behind him. That's
well, we're looking at per season this year, not total contract.
Sure, okay.
Not the whole $250 million or whatever. He was on a whatever 4-year $170 million or something.
Yeah,
something like that.
All right, our goal is to keep this interview within one episode's length. This is not helping, Dr. Yaqub. So I want to introduce this topic. I love personality. This is my favorite thing to talk about. Why? Because it allows us to take things that are often black and white, as in you either have a personality disorder like borderline PD, we talked about this with Pete Davidson, or you don't, which is a bunch of goddamn motherfucking bullshit, as you're going to learn today. So we're going to talk about personality disorders, more importantly, personality traits. We're going to talk about them on a spectrum. As a result, Dr. Yaqub is going to teach us here in a second, that different personalities use different types of defense mechanisms. If you want a review on individual defense mechanisms and what they are and good examples, well, then you're going to need to follow on the Instagram page, Sorry Not Sorry, where we're doing a defense of the day, giving you a little background and a pop culture example of every defense mechanism that our heroes talked about. Dr. Yaqub, teach the people. What do you love about this? What's important to know? Let's get going. What do you like about personality and defense?
Unfortunately, as a Lions fan, I always look for more defense and more strength in defense, right? We have the best offense in the league, but we have a very porous defense. But, jokes aside, defense is kind of, when we talk about psychological defense, it's how we react when there's a big stressor, right? And not everyone's always going to have healthy defenses, right? We came in talking about Michigan and Connor Stallions. I said, who is this guy? I never heard of him. I was denying that the cheating existed in order to preserve the idealization of my team.
Sports fandom pushes us. And we did this with Eric in episode 6. Like, sports fandom fucks us into immature defense mechanisms, right? So that is normal shit, everybody. Listen loud. This is all normal stuff we do all the time.
There was actually a recent article talking about sports fandom that in states that have legalized betting, there's actually been higher rates of domestic violence in those states on big sports days like Sundays. So we can talk about how those defenses collapse in order, for how psychological
pain on sports fanaticism, and not that we can't touch on it here, but Tareq will come back when we do a full sports fanaticism episode, which maybe we'll have to do next week. It's football season. It's going to be the time. Yeah, man, I really like how you are normalizing this. That's what we want to do today, is take these complicated topics and be like, look, this is all of us all the time.
Yeah. And so you asked me, sorry, I'm so long-winded, but what do I like about defenses and personalities is we think about personality, just like you said, not in this black and white way. Does someone have a personality disorder or not? But what structures someone's personality? When do they shine, and when do they act in ways that maybe alienate people from them, right? And that is how someone may come off as charismatic or manipulative or annoying or whatever we want to call them, right? But that's a manifestation of the defenses they're using oftentimes, right? If someone is stressed, we respond in different ways. Like we talked about denial. That's usually a pretty immature way to respond to something, right? But it's a natural response when you hear something you don't want to hear. Your first gut reaction in order to preserve your sense of self and what you like in the world or how you view the world is to not deny that bad things happen.
When we talk about a sense of self, right? It's sense of self, which Tareq used. If we haven't explained sense of self, we're going to do that a lot today. It's this core idea of it's the kind of beliefs that we hold, our view of the world, of how we view ourselves, others, and the world around us, generally speaking. So that is what is like a sense of self. So we're going to talk about Tareq talked about being able to retain your sense of self within denial, right? If you see something happen that makes you no longer believe the world is safe, well, your shit's fucked. Like you watch somebody get murdered and you used to believe the world is safe. You're going to try to deny that. You're going to try to explain it away. You're going to try and say that has nothing to do with me. And keep yourself sane, which is totally normal, natural.
Yeah. And, there's we look at defenses on a spectrum. Some are, some people look at it as immature versus mature. Some people look at it as like psychotic versus neurotic defenses. And maybe we get in the nuances of that. But, that doesn't mean that somebody always uses mature defenses, right? Like we all are going to use different levels of defenses. It's just which area do we use the most is kind of representative of how well we deal with psychological distress or attacks, right?
Yeah. I like to say we have like a set point. So let's go into the spectrum. I like this, Tareq. I think that people here can understand this. So when we talk about personality structure, okay, our GOAT, Nancy McWilliams, uses her book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. It's my fucking girl. I have a list, Tareq, of people that I want to get on the show. And my champion list is Bill Lawrence, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, who made South Park, and Nancy McWilliams. Those are like my 3 goats. And so it's like my 4 goats, I guess. But like those are a good example. So we talk about personality structure as a spectrum, guys. We're always going to be on a spectrum today. neurotic defenses. Neurotic organization means neurotic means anxious. That's a Freud term, right? We came up with this idea of like when we're feeling nervous or anxious about something, that means neurosis. And generally speaking, we're still anchored to reality in that neurotic organization. So you're like worried and like, oh my gosh, but then, my mom's plane is going to crash. But then you kind of glue yourself back together and you're like, hold on. It's not going to crash. That never happens. Like the data shows, right? So that's neurotic. Borderline, which we're going to come back to here in a minute, and psychotic organization. This does not mean schizophrenia. This means that your state of being or the defenses you're using, as Tareq talked about with denial is a psychotic level and immature defense mechanism, because if you're just denying that something happened, you are out of touch with reality. Now, that does not mean you are psychotic. It does not mean you have schizophrenia. That means that you are out of touch with reality. A borderline personality comes from this idea that a person's set point is in between psychotic and neurotic. And as Tareq told us, the stress hardship or a stressor could push a person into psychotic levels of organization. And most people, Tareq, tell me, maybe you disagree with this, most people have like a set point. Their kind of baseline when they're not terribly stressed is somewhere on that spectrum. And we're going to talk about that in these examples in a little bit.
No, I mean, I love that idea of set point, and I think for us, if we're trying to relate defenses and personality, that set point is how we should think about personality.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, and Tareq, you do this with your students, and I used to teach the med students at CU. This is how I framed it. I wanted people to understand, because when I was in medical school, Tareq, I wonder if it felt this way for you. We had our block on psych, and personality disorders were taught to us as if like you either popped out the womb with borderline personality disorder or you didn't. And it's like, what the fuck? Like, this stuff develops because of certain households and certain genetic traits in certain environments. It's complicated. Like, how could we talk about personality in such a like rigid way? It's everything we're talking about. And so is that how it seemed to you when you learned it?
Yeah,
Not in residency.
and I think as a med student, as they're trying to present you with a symptom and a diagnosis, and in other diagnoses we're taught about, there's diagnostic criteria. But like we often get the physiology as the etiology of something, right? And that's where I think medical education falls short. Like they don't give us an explanatory model at all of how someone gets to this point. They just say like, memorize these symptoms. This is what makes someone borderline, and you lose the depth of the human being in that regard.
Right. So when we talk about personality disorders, so I'll give examples of one we've all heard of: borderline personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. We're going to get to in a little bit. We touched upon that in Harrison's episode on social anxiety. So the idea of a personality disorder is, again, how you're organized. Your personality is structured in a way that your set point is far enough towards psychotic that you display these things most or all of the time, these features that we're going to talk about, and they get in the way of your social, which means your dating life, your friends, and occupational functioning. So that's jobs, school, being able to provide for yourself. So again, any psychiatric diagnosis as the DSM, the purple book, it sucks. Tareq and I are bound to it. Tareq, you're in. Zach last week worked as, I do not work for a company that gives a fuck what I say. God bless Psychiatry Rep. And so they do care. They've been very supportive. Rep, Psychiatry, great brand. But like if you're in academia or you gotta mind your tongue. So Dr. Yaqub won't say some things because he likes being at Northwestern and he wants to run the show someday. And he could. He's got bones for it. So I don't give a fuck. I can say whatever I want. And so a personality disorder is stupid as we construct it. Tareq and I are going to talk about the research here for a little bit. And note that psychologists, not psychiatrists, do not prescribe to personality disorder construct. They talk about personality dimensions. And that is sort of, Tareq, if you think about the alternative method of personality diagnosis in the back of the DSM, which hopefully becomes the way we do it, it's much more like, what are the traits that are causing you problems, and at what level, it's like a 0 to 3 scale maybe, are they causing you problems? And so that is delightfully what we're shifting towards in psychiatry, though just like anything, education, medicine, all that shit's going to take far too long. But I wanted to shout out psychology because I do try to emphasize in the show, Tark, that we're psychiatrists. We have the medical perspective. And I had the male therapist episode. So we respect other people's educations. Because I would say generally, psychologists and psychiatrists have extremely different educations. And if they learn this psychodynamic Freud stuff, it's because they went to a program to learn it on purpose. It does not mean they learned it in their training. Most psychologists, I don't know most, but I don't know how many get trained in psychodynamics, depending on their research.
Yeah. And there's a historical legacy to that. Psychoanalysis used to be only available to MDs, right? Doctors, medical doctors. So psychologists, social workers, people who are licensed therapists, people who are really good therapists were actually barred from psychoanalytic training for decades. So, on an institutional level, I think you would see why you wouldn't incorporate that model that excluded you for so long, especially when the biggest knock on psychoanalysis is that it's theory based and often not
Not enough
empirical or objective finding based.
Not enough research backing.
Exactly. And then I know
There's
you've
more
talked about
now.
Jonathan Shedler. Yeah, you've talked about Jonathan Shedler before, so there's definitely some research.
Yeah, and we're not saying there's not enough research, but Tarek's point is that, why not have more people doing this and prove the point? Tarek, I would argue that psychoanalysis in general has gate kept the practice the whole time. So talk about what you've done so far in your training and what the rest would look like and where you think the gatekeeping is right now.
So, to be blunt and kind of facetious, I talk about the gatekeeping psychoanalysis. It's like the best pyramid scheme around. It is kind of like Star Wars. Like you're a Jedi, you have a master that you report to, and I'll talk a little bit more detail on that in the full psychoanalytic training, right?
Yeah.
But I haven't done full psychoanalytic training, right. And because it's in this kind of cultish pyramid scheme model, although I love it, I don't know if I'll ever pursue that full training.
You did PTP.
Yeah, so what was called for me was ACAP. It was like Advanced Adult and Child Adolescent Psychodynamic Psychotherapy Program. That's what.
Okay, so what was that like?
So that was we met once a week, and it was like a 3-hour class on Mondays, and we had to read probably 100 pages a week of theory, and it was there was 5-week blocks that all focused on themes, whether it was defenses, whether it was years. And it was over 2 years. Yeah. And our cohort was about 9 or 10 people.
And so out here in Colorado, the Denver or the Colorado Psychoanalytic Society calls that PTPs. The reason I have not done Colorado's version of this is because it's Friday afternoons. I refuse to get these people my Friday afternoons. I cannot. So if anybody from Colorado Psychoanalytic Community, my own therapist, Heath, shout out. I know tons of analysts, training people that were so great to us, and fuck that. So, Tarek, let's dive in. So I really think we're in a good position to kind of dive into personality. Quick summary, and then we're going to go into these individual personality disorders, and you're going to hear me and Tarek bitch about how these individual categorizations don't make sense, because as the research would show us, all this bullshit's on a spectrum. These are traits. These are things that are all within us. None of this is unique to individual humans, okay? That's what we're going to learn today. Everybody has a set point, and when you're stressed, that set point pushes you more towards psychotic organization or regression. So psychotic organization, we've heard me talk about that immature defense mechanisms are things we do when we're younger. So stress regresses us, and therefore we're using less mature defenses or more towards psychosis. Because again, baby you pops out the womb a little narcissist and a little psychotic. No, I don't mean a little bit. I mean tiny. You're a baby narcissist and a baby psychotic, because the world revolves around you. You don't know yet that the rest of the world's out there. These two blurry figures until your vision gets better. That's right. Babies can't see. Do people know that? I don't know. Babies can't see. I had to learn that in medical school. And the world revolves around them. They don't know shit about shit. Okay? Except pooping in their diaper and somebody comes and changes them. So that is what we're saying here, is that depending on trauma, depending on safety of the environment you're in, depending upon your parents, depending upon luck and biologic factors, how much you mature from that baby Narcissist with immature defenses? Depends. Not everybody does. Tareq, I'm actually going to cover the topic just for you to know that I'm going to do an individual topic, and I do at the start of every episode. And this week, I'm going to do age is just a number and talk about the idea of just because we grow older doesn't mean we grow up. So if you're listening to this interview and you haven't listened to that part, that is what we're talking about. Okay, your organization might not mature based on how your life has gone. Okay, so that'll be in the beginning of this episode if you haven't heard it yet, set the stage for this conversation today. All right, and so Tareq, you want to talk about clusters? The fuck's a personality cluster?
Well, I just want to say one thing before we get to clusters is like there's this, one of the things about that set point and that personality and how you respond to stuff is not just fully dependent on you, like you said. And there's a whole field in psychoanalysis is that's object relations, and we can't really talk about personality without talking about that. We won't get in the depths of it, but it is essentially a field that focuses on what you just talked about, how your early life relationships affect the defenses you go on to develop, and how that affects your personality structure.
Object relations. Let's shout out Melanie Klein. Let's shout out Winnicott. Let's shout out the homies that deserve it. And Tareq, Satish, and I sat around for like 30 minutes one night and said, can we make an entertaining episode about object relations? And I said, no. It is a dry, confusing topic. And Tareq just did, all we need to know is object relations came right after Freud started. Melanie Klein was like a competitor of Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, not just because they were both women, because they were practicing and coming up with things at the same time. And her idea was psychologically, the root of us all is how we as an object relate to the other objects in our life, which is, again, totally makes sense. But it's weird in a way that we couldn't find a whole episode about it. So I agree with you, Tareq, right? The way our kind of personality is set and kind of our way of seeing the world is very much in an object relations fashion, where it's like, what has been my experience with these objects around me? And that, unless things get more stable for you, is going to be the way you see the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, that set point, like we said, we've tried to identify specific personality disorders, right? And I use disorders in air quotes, is that the research really doesn't show that there's that much there's not that much consistency in saying this is for sure a narcissistic personality versus a borderline personality. But as we try to look at things in a spectrum, there's been like 3 clusters of personality structures that we're looking at. And those structures are kind of euphemistically talked about as weird, wild, and worried, right? And all that's saying is that there are some people that in the weird cluster, we adopt defenses that involve maybe some odd thinking, or the wild one is saying when stressed we get dramatic or super impulsive, and that's kind of the wild aspect of things. Those are kind of the defenses. And I think worried kind of just tells you what it is. Like, you often rely on others to calm your sense of anxiety or worry. There's sometimes a difficulty in relying on yourself to provide some sort of stability. You often have to rely on others to make you feel calm. It's hard to self-soothe.
Which is, it's funny, Tareq, because maybe outside of the cluster A people, but like I'd argue that, and our cluster A is the rarest of these, so we're going to get into this right now, but we all need other people to help us self-soothe. It's really fucking normal. This is just looks a little different, and Tareq and I'll get into that. So how this is going to go, all right? There are 4, 3, 3, 11, no, 8, what's 4 plus 6? 10 personality disorders. And again, we hate these, and this is what we're using because you'll see it's a great structure for understanding this stuff. There's 10 of these. We're going to go through a definition. We're going to bullshit about the important things for you to know, to take away, and we're going to use a couple famous examples. We're going to try and keep this tight. Tareq, I say to myself and I say to you, 5 minutes per. That keeps us under 90 minutes. Let's rock. All right, the first cluster A. So cluster A is schizoid, schizotypal, and paranoid personality disorders. Schizoid is first up. Definition is this is a lifelong pattern of detachment from social relationships and a limited range of emotional expression or affect.
So the schizoid, like you said, I mean, you used our big words maybe from the DSM, but these are what colloquially people will call loners, or maybe isolative introverts.
Yeah.
They're the
Intense
people that are
introverts,
very
yeah.
comfortable just being by themselves. Intense introverts, not to the point where these are not people that are introverts because they're depressed or anxious. These are people that just don't are totally content
Egosyntonic.
with their own company.
We've talked about
Yeah.
egosyntonic and egodystonic on the show. If you go
And
back to the
so
OCD, OCPD. So these people know that recluse, shut in, loner, lone wolf, crazy cat person, gender neutral, right? These are ideas we think of when we think of schizoid. And Tarek, your point's the best is this does not mean they're anxious. We're going to get to that later. This is not social anxiety. This is egosyntonic isolation. Some famous examples, Tarek. We thought about this for a while. Apparently, Lee Harvey Oswald was a shut-in. I guess that would make you assassinate a nice guy like Abraham Lincoln. We don't talk politics. If you don't like Lincoln, I got nothing to say. I don't know.
Abraham Lincoln, bro, what? You mean
What?
he's JF? He's JF. He killed JFK.
Who is the John Wilkes Booth? John Wilkes Booth. Hold on. I'm going to keep all this shit in here, Tarek. Reading High School rep, okay? Public school kid. I've learned a lot. And I'm not from Rochester Hills, Michigan. I'm not from The Rock, Tarek, okay? Some of this stuff gets confused. Three-worded
The
assassins.
Rock, baby.
Rock. All right. That was so. Hey, what was that? A little bit of projecting onto Tarek, a little bit of acting out, because I was ashamed that I fucked that up on camera. We're all normal. I certainly don't know everything. Tarek, my apologies for lashing out. So Lee Harvey Oswald killed a nice guy like John F. Kennedy. No, we're not talking politics. I actually don't know if JFK was like a BHoF candidate, but I'd say Lincoln was. So, Bro Motion's Hall of Fame candidate for those listening for the first time. So Dexter from the HBO show Dexter, significant loner, really flat affect, even though he was doing these crazy murderous things. And then Ron Swanson, that's our guy. Loved being in the woods, didn't want to talk to people, and we could all agree, like, wasn't depressed, getting laid plenty. And Ron Swanson and Tammy's are a great example of gas and brakes in a relationship. We're going to talk about this a ton. Ron Swanson is so chill emotionally that those people tend to gravitate towards people with a lot more emotionality. So it's really not a surprise that somebody like Ron Swanson was dating some women who, like, were unstable. We might say the kind of crazy you read about. Schizotypal personality. Eccentric behavior and cognitive, so thoughts, or perceptual, so vision, auditory, tactile, distortion. So that could mean like light hallucination experiences. Schizotypal, we want to think of magical thinking. So magical thinking just means that you have faith in things that you cannot see. Tarek, what do you think about schizotypals?
I think I employ, and some of us employ, some schizotypal thinking every Sunday when we say, "Hey, don't talk about my fantasy team. Don't talk about this player because you're gonna jinx them." And we keep quiet, and yeah. So we all employ all these superstitions. Are schizotypal in nature, and some of them, they can have some positive things in our lives. Someone could argue like prayer is a form of schizotypal ways of relating, but it can serve you very well.
Yeah. I wanted to, look, I think people have all heard me say we don't talk religion, we don't talk politics. Okay. And so Tarek is doing the brave thing of bringing up what is really a point of religion, faith, prayer, or forms of magical thinking. Now, I'm not trying to ruffle feathers. The idea here is, again, a belief in something you cannot see. And so that is what we're saying is you pray. And it does ground you. It's good for you. It's pretty fucking healthy, except when any of these things, superstitions, crystals, astrology, faith, any of these things get extreme, then you get into it being a problem. Okay? So, like, if you need something to change in your life and all you do is pray, well, that's probably not so helpful. What would be helpful is prayer, asking your friends to pray, which is support. You're getting support from your community, and also seeking advice, right? Like you're praying for good things, and you also want to actually, do practical things, get advice, seek counsel, and make sure that you're an active participant in your life too. Okay, so I think it's about as neutral as we can touch on it.
Exactly.
Because if you think about it, right, on a spectrum of this stuff, it's sports, superstitions, fanaticism, right? Faith in things you cannot see, and then full on eccentricity. Willy Wonka is the extreme example of this. Cosmo Kramer is a lighter example. Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter, she's pretty on the extreme too. So, all right, the final of our cluster A's. This is the weird and honestly probably the most straightforward of the clusters. Paranoid personality disorder. None of this shit is straightforward. I appreciate your smile, Tarek. Paranoia and a pervasive, long standing suspiciousness and general mistrust of others. Pervasive is an important word because paranoia is a psychotic symptom if we were to be diagnosing schizophrenia. We are not doing that. These are people who are paranoid of things generally, think conspiracy theorist, okay? And when they get more stressed, that gets worse. So schizophrenia implied, this is why it says pervasive. Schizophrenic symptoms up and go. They start later in life. They are controlled by medications, auditory hallucinations, thinking. These people have marriages, they have jobs. Okay, so that is worth noting as a difference. Medication does not help paranoid PD. What are your thoughts, Tarek?
That's the most unfortunate thing, that
Yeah.
paranoia here doesn't seem to be oftentimes diffusely detached from reality, right? These are the people sometimes who are very distrustful of like very something very specific but can maintain in other ways. I've had some people with specific paranoia about preservatives in foods, for example, and they really cut down how much they're eating because they think that all food is going to give them cancer in the future,
The eating
and
disorder
there's some sort
intersection with
of plot
dissemble.
against them for that.
Yeah, totally. I was just thinking about like the eating disorder intersection with
The,
this in particular. That's like, yeah, just
yeah,
wild. It's wild stuff to treat. It's really hard. And there's so much of that misinformation on the internet now. It's fucking people up.
well, exactly. Well, the thing is, like, I often use a very, very high achieving patient with an eating disorder as an example of this, like this example that we had of like what's a borderline organization, what's neurotic, and what's psychotic. Like
Yeah.
a very successful, high achieving graduate student who had a little bit of an eating disorder around exam time, probably started overeating, started gaining weight, but was convinced that people were putting extra fats in their food, and that's why they were gaining weight, and it was due to the stressful situation, right? And so that would be kind of somebody who at a set point is based in reality, but when stress kind of gets
Yeah.
into this borderline way of quasi psychotic ways of understanding the world. But you know, I kind of veered away from paranoid, but
I
we talked
I like
about the
I
three.
like it, man. And that's what I was just gonna say was with Tarek, like all this stuff, you're gonna keep hearing this, and I've tried to keep Tarek on a schedule. We're doing pretty good time wise. And so the idea here, like if I these are hard to kind of put on the neurotic, borderline psychotic, which is what I was trying to do was to name characters who existed in each or give you examples.
Mhm.
This one's actually pretty straightforward. Dale Gribble from King of the Hill is a conspiracy theorist, right? General mistrust of the government, but has a job, has a wife. Shout out John Redcorn, laying the pipe on Nancy Gribble. We always know. Everything I know about Texas is from King of the Hill. Shout out all my Texan friends who listen to this. And so, like, doomsday preppers, that might be like borderline. And then I've talked about like full on, like foil on the head. So, Better Call Saul, if you've seen that, Chuck McGill, Charles McGill, very high functional attorney, and as his life starts to fall apart around him, he ends up like putting foil all over the walls of his house and putting foil on his head. He's not schizophrenic. He does not get disorganized. He does not end up showing hallucinations. He gets very paranoid and is very worried about like people tapping his phones. You could call this a delusional disorder, Tarek, probably at its strength. Delusional disorder is a separate diagnosis that looks a lot like this. The difference is delusional disorder is usually specific to one thing. Delusional disorder, also sadly, Tarek, I've had there's delusional. What's it called when you think you have bugs all over you, or like a specific concern that someone's tapping your phone, but like the meds don't work. That is my
Mhm.
frustrating takeaway from paranoid PD and delusional disorder.
Yeah, same. And I think what I've really appreciated is in each one of these in this cluster, we've talked about like a mild form, and then the most kind of extreme form. So, like in
Yeah.
schizoid, we saw kind of like loners, and then probably the most extreme of schizoid is the guy who's living in his basement as he doesn't care about friends and just playing video games all day.
A straight up
He's
recluse,
he's
shut in.
he's happy, but
Yeah.
maybe he's still in his parents' basement.
Yeah.
Then schizotypal, we all have some magical beliefs, but once it starts getting to the point where it makes us inactive agents in our lives, that's an extreme end. And then, with paranoid, yeah, we talked about maybe some food contamination fears, and maybe that goes into OCD also. But to the point where you put foils in your tin foil in your head, like you can be a high functioning person that's distrustful of the government. And I know it's not political, but maybe there's reasons some people are
And
distrustful of
oh,
the government.
I mean, yeah, totally. I wouldn't argue. I mean, people can have their thoughts on that, but I think we know what we're talking about, like conspiracy theorists, like kind of a
Yeah,
pervasive suspicion, mistrust. That's your set point. You're not trusting in
exactly.
general. Yeah, which could look a lot of different. Like not being trustful in general is going to be a cluster B trait that we talk about. So, Tark, I like your wrap up. We're going way back in time machine for our oldest Bro Motions Hall of Fame inductee this week, the 16th president of these United States, Abraham Lincoln. If you've been watching the whole episode, you can go back and see how I put my foot in my mouth by not realizing who Lee Harvey Oswald was versus John Wilkes Booth. A little flashback, go check it out. So, as we know, Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky and mostly raised in Illinois. A self-educated man, became a lawyer and went on to be an Illinois state representative, worked his way to the U.S. House of Representatives for Illinois. And something I don't feel like I learned in school is that he actually went back to just practicing law in the 1940s, was a really successful lawyer back in Illinois, and he re-entered politics in 1854 following the agreement of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially extended into those more central, newer territories the right to slavery. And so this was, again, remember, a states' rights issue where they were letting state by state decide what they wanted to do with slavery. And so Lincoln, a staunch anti-slavery stance, as we all know, decided to use that impetus to re-enter politics and eventually run for president. In 1860, he became our 16th president, which was quickly followed by, because people knew what he felt about slavery and how it was going to go from there, 4 months after he was elected president, that the southern states started seceding from the Union and formed the Confederacy of States. Shortly after that was the first violent attack on Fort Sumter and therefore the start of the Civil War. Really what Lincoln is best known for is the way he handled the Civil War and how he was able to manage the complicated nature of a war-torn country, especially around an issue as big as slavery, a moral rights issue, an ethical issue. People will talk about politics. Slavery is a political issue, which to me on this podcast, we're not talking politics. We're not talking religion. We're just an anti-slavery podcast. And I think that's okay for us to come out and say. So Lincoln famously gave his 1863 Gettysburg Address a few months following the end of the Civil War and the Confederacy waving the white flag, as it were. 7 years ago, we know the Gettysburg Address, and this still goes down as one of the most important speeches in American history, as Lincoln was on the path to trying to repair a country that seemed to be irreparable. Followed closely by the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment of freeing the slaves, and then a few years later, he'd re-won a second term of election in 1864, and clearly a lot of people still not ready for that or not ready to see what the change in this country was going to become. He was assassinated at the Ford Theater while watching a play, by John Wilkes Booth, not Lee Harvey Oswald. Sad that anybody would think that that's an acceptable answer. We've seen assassination attempts on other famous figures, on John F. Kennedy, on Donald Trump recently, and just thinking that those things are within people's grasp is pretty scary. And for somebody like Lincoln, he knew what was on the line. I mean, he knew what could happen if he went the way he went, which was just to kind of free this country of slavery and the hold that it had on the nation and the economy at the time. Grace and poise with which he handled the management of the country is really what he's left his legacy as. Is he had both factions mad at him, his own party at the time wanted harsher punishments for the Confederacy. Obviously, the Confederate nation or states wanted to kill him. And this is a man who had to handle, both those sides coming at him and figure out how to put this path back on track to working together. So not black nor white, as was in both sides of his ear, angel nor devil. This man really found a way to try and bring people together. And that's what's led him to be known by most as the greatest president in U.S. history. So, just kind of reflecting on that and whether it be a joke that came out of the last thing that, Abe Lincoln, our oldest BHoF inductee so far. Maybe we'll keep going back in the time machine and see where else we can go. So we'll be back to close it out in just a minute, y'all. All right. Let's wrap up as we do by setting our sources and taking some things away from this episode. So sources today are less about books and things you can find and more about the historians and the doctors, the physicians, the therapists who really informed Tareq's conversation and I's today. So we shouted out a bunch of people: Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter; Melanie Klein and D.W. Winnicott with Object Relations Detour we took; Selma Freiberg is the author of Ghosts in the Nursery. Shout out. Go read it. Very findable, formative paper in how we understand people, children, mothers, dads, families, etc. Alice Miller, who we ripped on for not being able to dumb this shit down, and also still owe a lot for the idea of the drama of the gifted child. Lindsay Gibson's Adult Children of Emotionally Mature Parents, which is a great common day book. She's a great author. Recommend anything by her. And the GOAT, Nancy McWilliams, and her book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. You can find anything by her. She does these YouTube videos on the Picturing It with Elliot pages we've talked about. Really, really, really just 5-star at doing what we're trying to do here, which is explain complicated concepts in a way people can relate to and understand. So what are our 3 takeaways from today's episode? Number 1, just as we started with, we all get older. It does not mean we grow up. Let's try to be empathetic and understanding when people around us are acting in ways we don't understand. They've got a story too. Let's step out of our own mind and try to mentalize and get into their mind as best we can. 2, from the interview, these personality problems, things that we deem as siloed, black and white, you either have them or you don't, are within all of us, and they're on a spectrum. Okay, so how impacted you are by those things is based on many a factor, biology, and environment amongst them. Finally, as we inducted Abe Lincoln into the BHoF, let's remember that he was not best known for necessarily abolishing slavery. His key to success was that he was able to navigate conflict by not seeing things as black and white and by working both sides of the political spectrum to help bring the country back together at a time when it very, very easily could have been lost entirely. So if that feels specific or if that feels timely to the moment, let's all try and be a little more Lincoln-y and understand each other's perspectives and see if we can't bring this country back to the middle in terms of understanding one another and being able to work together. So that's about as political as we'll get on this podcast. There's nothing political about being nice. There's nothing political about being kind, which is always our goal. So let's get out there this week and try and be kinder and gentler.